Today we got to talk about one man who's supposed to represent justice, fairness, the very ideals that are meant to be the backbone of our legal system. But in reality, he stands as a pillar of everything that's wrong with this country. I'm talking about none other than Judge Clarence Thomas. It had been months since the American legal world was shaken by the news. An unprecedented $500 million lawsuit filed against Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traoré by none other than Judge Thomas, a senior figure in an international arbitration panel. The lawsuit accused Traoré of economic destabilization after his government terminated several multinational mining contracts tied to U.S.-based corporations. The case had quickly become political dynamite. African media hailed Traoré as a hero standing up against colonial economics, while Western outlets framed it as a reckless move that would damage international business confidence. But in private, those who knew the details understood something deeper. The lawsuit wasn't just about money. It was about power, precedent, and whether Africa could truly say no to the old economic order. The courtroom battle had been fierce. Traoré's legal team didn't just defend him. They dismantled the entire premise of the lawsuit. In front of global media, they exposed how the mining contract in question were signed under exploitive terms, funneling over 80% of profits overseas while leaving local communities impoverished. Documents surfaced showing that several of these deals had been brokered with bribes to former government officials long before Traoré came to power. Judge Thomas had listened from the bench, maintaining a stoic expression, but those close to him noticed subtle changes as the case unfolded. The furrowed brows, the moments where he paused before overruling objections, the way he seemed to lean forward more when witnesses from Burkina Faso spoke about villages losing their water sources to foreign mining operations. The turning point came during the testimony of Mayam Kabor, a teacher from the rural province of Ouagadougou. She described how her school, built with community labor, had no running water because the nearby river had been redirected for industrial mining use. Her voice shook, but her words were steady. "We were told the mining was for development," she said, "but our children walk 5 kilometers for water, and we cannot drink gold." Something in the courtroom shifted that day. Even the American press corps, usually quick to spin the story in corporate favor, struggled to paint her testimony as anything but heartbreaking. Judge Thomas asked an uncharacteristically personal question after her statement. And did anyone from these companies ever come back to see the impact? She shook her head only to collect more gold. From that moment, the case's momentum began to collapse. The evidence stacked against the corporations, the environmental damage reports, the unfair revenue splits, the hidden political donations. It became clear that pursuing the lawsuit to its conclusion could trigger not only a legal defeat for the corporations, but also a public relations disaster for the very system that had protected them for decades. 2 weeks before the scheduled verdict, an unannounced meeting took place in a small conference room inside the courthouse. Present were Judge Thomas, 2 senior court clerks, and Ibrahim Traoré himself, who had flown in quietly without the fanfare of state visits. No cameras, no aides, just the 2 men facing each other across a long wooden table. Thomas began slowly, his voice quieter than usual. "President Traoré, I have been in this profession for over 30 years. I have presided over cases involving billions of dollars, wars, and governments. But I must admit, I have never faced a case that forced me to confront my own beliefs like this one." Traoré didn't respond immediately, his gaze calm and steady. "I was wrong," Thomas continued. "Wrong not only in allowing this case to proceed without fully considering the historical and political weight behind it, but wrong in assuming that the economic status quo was inherently just. What your team presented, it was not just legal defense. It was truth, and truth is something I swore to uphold regardless of where it leads." For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the room's heating system. "I intend to dismiss the lawsuit in its entirety," Thomas said, "and I will make a public statement, not just that there was insufficient evidence, but that the premise itself was flawed." Traoré finally spoke. "You understand what that means?" Thomas nodded. "It will make enemies for me, but it is the right thing to do, and it is time I stop pretending that justice exists only within the boundaries drawn by those with power." 2 days later, the world watched as Judge Thomas took a seat in the packed courtroom. The cameras were rolling, the journalists poised with pens and microphones. When the moment came, his words were clear and deliberate. This court recognizes that the lawsuit brought against President Ibrahim Traoré and the state of Burkina Faso was not grounded in a fair or equitable understanding of international law. The agreements in question were exploitive, and the defense has demonstrated that they harmed the Burkina people. Therefore, I am not only dismissing this case in its entirety, but I am issuing an apology both to President Traoré and to the people of Burkina Faso for the time, resources, and dignity they have lost in this process. The room erupted, African journalists cheering quietly, some wiping away tears. Western corporate representatives sat frozen, the weight of the loss sinking in, and Ibrahim Traoré, stoic as ever, simply gave a single nod before standing to leave. Outside, the streets around the courthouse filled with supporters waving Burkina flags, chanting Traoré's name. For many, it wasn't just about one lawsuit. It was about validation. The rare moment when the machinery of international law, so often tilted against them, had for once tilted in their favor. But the story wasn't over, because while Judge Thomas's words had closed the case, they had opened a much bigger question. What would happen now that a senior Western judge had publicly admitted that the economic rules governing Africa were built on exploitation? That question, and the storm would unleash, was about to change the political map forever. The morning after Judge Thomas's historic ruling, the sun rose over Ouagadougou to the sound of radio hosts speaking in tones usually reserved for national holidays. Across Africa, the judgment had already been dubbed the day of legal liberation. But in Washington, Paris, and London, the atmosphere was different. The boardrooms of mining conglomerates buzzed with emergency calls. Stock prices for several resource companies with African operations had begun to slide within hours of Thomas's ruling. Shareholders wanted answers, and executives were furious. Inside one particularly tense meeting at the headquarters of Continental Resources International, a CEO slammed his hand on the table. This sets a dangerous precedent. If one African leader can walk away from a $500 million lawsuit with a handshake and an apology, what's to stop the rest from tearing up our contracts? In the midst of this panic, Judge Thomas himself was facing a whirlwind. Overnight, his inbox had flooded with thousands of emails, some praising his courage, others warning him that he had committed career suicide. Several of his oldest friends in legal circles privately advised him to step away from the bench for his own safety. But Thomas, who had spent decades in the shadows of procedural neutrality, found himself strangely calm. For the first time, he felt like a judge, not just an administrator of corporate interests. Meanwhile, Ibrahim Traoré returned to Burkina Faso, greeted at the airport by an ocean of supporters. The streets were lined with people waving handmade signs. Traoré, defender of Africa, our land is not for sale, and we stand with truth. That night, the president appeared on national television. He did not speak of personal victory. Instead, his speech focused on the wider meaning of the ruling. What happened in that courtroom is not just for Burkina Faso, Traoré said, his voice carrying the weight of generations. It is for every farmer in Mali, every fisherman in Senegal, every miner in the Congo who has been told that their suffering is the price of progress. It is for every child in Africa who deserves a future without chains, visible or invisible. His words ignited a wave of solidarity. Within days, leaders from across the continent began making statements. President Paul Kagame of Rwanda called the ruling a crack in the wall of economic appetite. Kenya's William R. announced that his government would review all foreign contracts for signs of exploitation. South Africa's parliament scheduled an emergency session to discuss resource sovereignty, but not everyone celebrated. In the corridors of the United Nations, tension was rising. Several Western ambassadors were quietly pressuring the UN Economic Council to issue a statement reaffirming the importance of honoring international contracts. The subtext was clear. They feared that Thomas's ruling would embolden African nations to challenge decades of lopsided agreements. It was during one such tense meeting that the unexpected happened. Judge Thomas himself arrived at the UN uninvited. Wearing a simple dark suit, he walked past the cameras without answering questions and requested the floor at a special session on economic justice. When granted permission to speak, he stood before the assembly, his voice carrying none of the legal jargon one might expect. I am here today not as a representative of the United States, not as a corporate lawyer in disguise, but as a man who has seen the truth in the eyes of those whose lives are destroyed by systems they did not choose. The lawsuit against President Traoré was not just a legal matter. It was a moral test. And I failed that test until the evidence forced me to see what was always there. A global economy built on unequal terms is nothing more than legalized theft. The chamber was silent. African delegates listened intently while some Western representatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I do not expect applause, Thomas continued, but I do expect change. If international law is to mean anything, it must serve all nations equally, not just those with the power to enforce their will. The speech went viral within hours. Clips flooded social media, subtitled in dozens of languages. Young Africans called Thomas the judge who broke the chains. In Burkina Faso, a mural of him shaking Traoré's hand appeared overnight on the side of a government building. The political ripple effects were immediate. A coalition of African nations proposed a continental resource charter, a framework to ensure that no foreign contract could be signed without transparent terms and community approval. The charter, clearly inspired by the courtroom victory, became a rallying point. Back in the U.S., however, the backlash against Thomas was ferocious. Several senators called for an investigation into his conduct, accusing him of undermining American economic interests. Op-eds painted him as a naive idealist who had fallen for African populism. But public opinion, especially among younger Americans, was shifting. Many saw him as a man who had chosen principle over profit. Weeks later, Thomas traveled quietly to Ouagadougou at Traoré's invitation. This time, it wasn't for a hearing or political theater. They met privately in the presidential compound without media or ceremony. "You didn't have to come," Traoré said as they sat down. "I did," Thomas replied. "Apologies delivered in front of cameras can feel hollow. I wanted you to hear from me as one man to another that I am sorry for my role in perpetuating a system that hurt your people." Traoré studied him for a moment, then smiled faintly. "It takes courage to admit when you've been wrong. That is rare in politics, rarer still in the law." Thomas nodded. "I hope this is not the end, but the beginning of something better." The two men spoke for hours about law, justice, the weight of history, and the stubbornness of entrenched power. They parted without promises, but with a shared understanding. The fight ahead was larger than both of them, but their unexpected alliance had already struck a blow no one could ignore. In the months that followed, the $500 million lawsuit became a cautionary tale in boardrooms and diplomatic circles. It was no longer just a case file. It was a symbol, and somewhere in that symbol was the quiet image of an American judge and an African soldier president standing side by side, daring the world to imagine a system where justice was not for hail.